What's up, guys? Alternate reality CJ from Team Millennium Ninja here. What's going on? Well, that was weird. What's up, guys? Original reality CJ from Team Millennium Ninja here. Although I probably should have shaved after I recorded this bit for continuity. Oh well, I guess we're sticking with the goatee going forward here. But I'm back once again and excited to be talking about today's topic, which is the manga that would ultimately become the series we all know and love as Kenichi the Mighty Disciple. But not quite. And that's why I'm so excited to talk about it, because I think this is one of the most interesting tidbits about a manga's creation that I've personally come across. With this story not actually having anything to do with the story of Kenichi, with it being more of a what-if scenario, kind of like the Romance Dawn one-shots from before One Piece actually started, where we get to see the characters and characters resembling characters that we know from the actual series, but with a different twist on the plot as a whole. Now take that and expand it into a 30-volume manga, and that's basically what we have here. Although in regards to One Piece, Oda has gone on record saying that he changed the plot of the one-shots in order to not spoil readers on the future plot of One Piece. And I'm not exactly sure if we could say the same about Matsuno here, as this version of the story, known as Tatakae Ryozanpaku Shijo Saikyo no Deshi, or in English as Fight Ryozanpaku History's Strongest Disciple, which I'll be referring to as History's Strongest from here on out for the sake of brevity. But History's Strongest and Kenichi had a much different start than One Piece did, with History's Strongest being published in the Shonen Sunday S magazine, which was known as Shonen Sunday Super at the time, a monthly shonen magazine which is an offshoot of the weekly Shonen Sunday magazine, which would be the magazine where Kenichi would make its over decade-long run, with Shonen Sunday Super usually being a place for newer manga artists to break into the industry. With that being the case for Matsuno here, as while History's Strongest wasn't his first published work, it would be his first running series, which would ultimately get picked up by Weekly Shonen Sunday and remade into Kenichi. So because of that, I'm not completely sure on the reason for the differences between both manga, as it could be like I mentioned earlier, where Matsuno didn't want to spoil readers of both manga on the plot to come, but I think I lean more towards the side that the changes between the two manga were a natural progression of ideas from Matsuno, with him getting some more experience under his belt through the publication of History's Strongest, and so making changes to the story when readapting it for Kenichi in order to make it more interesting. But because of the obscurity of this manga, information is pretty sparse on it, so the only thing I really have to go on is my own personal interpretation of the manga, unfortunately. But one thing I do know is that when reading Kenichi, it always struck me how well structured and laid out the story was from the get-go. Whereas in my experience of reading manga over the years, I've noticed that a decent amount of artists seem to struggle with their manga's direction early on, especially if it's based off of a one-shot or a not super well thought out concept. And you'll see it all the time, even in bigger magazines like Shonen Jump, where new series are canceled before they even really get a chance to find their footing, or being changed drastically from the initial idea of the series, with a couple notable examples being Yu Yu Hakusho and even Dragon Ball, with them both taking turns from their more spiritual and adventurous elements into more typical battle shonens based on tournaments. But as we'll soon see, Matsuno had an idea for the characters and story of Kenichi before ever even pressing his pen down on the first page. And for the most part throughout the story of History's Strongest, the plot points are basically the same or similar as in early Kenichi. So I've written the script assuming that you guys are already familiar with the story of the Kenichi anime or manga. And if you're not, make sure to check the series out or the videos that I made covering it before. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at the original Kenichi manga. The first thing you'll probably notice when opening up this manga for the first time is the very similar visual style between this series and Kenichi, which sounds obvious, but I think it's important to note the differences, as another thing that impressed me about the Kenichi manga when first reading it was the art style, as despite Matsuno evolving as an artist throughout the series run, as is common when you draw the same stuff every week for over a decade, unlike a lot of manga out there though, Kenichi had it styled down from chapter 1, something which is obviously owed to History's Strongest, as we'll see throughout that a lot of the characters would undergo redesigns, some which would make the characters sleeker and more appealing, while others might have ended up losing some of their edge. Either way, we still have the same basic designs for our protagonists Kenichi and Miyu, who open up the manga yet again, this time though without the hook of the subsequent series where Miyu knocks Kenichi down, instead opting for a more typical and, in my opinion, much less interesting start to the manga, with Kenichi watering the flowers at school and checking his watch in anticipation of Miyu passing by on her bike. And I just want to make a side note real quick that Miyu rides this bike a decent amount in this manga, which was a bit weird to me since I don't think she ever rides a bike at all in the Kenichi manga. So it was interesting seeing just how much it popped up in this version. Getting back to Kenichi though, he watches her ride past lamenting that this is the only fun part of school left for him. With the next page showing that in this manga, Kenichi is still very much a victim of bullying, as his bullies actively pull him away to the dojo to be used as a ragdoll for their judo practice, and it also being shown that even the sensei doesn't care enough about his well-being to interrupt the bullying. And so after being beaten up by the judo club, Kenichi returns to finish watering the flowers, where he's ambushed by his bullies yet again, who then proceed to smash up the flowers much like the karate club does later in the Kenichi series, which prompts Kenichi to try and stand up to them, ending with him getting nailed in the back of the head by a baseball bat, with the bullies proceeding to beat him up even more afterward. And Kenichi's bullying seems to be really ramped up in this version, being much more of a victim than in the later incarnation, with him not actively provoking anything to cause it in this version. Whereas in Kenichi proper, there's at least the motivations of him joining the karate club, which the other club members didn't like. But the bullies in this version seem much more actively aggressive towards him, beating him so badly he struggles on his walk home, ultimately collapsing and thinking to himself that he needs to change schools again. But instead of going through with that, instead he resolves to become stronger. Where according to the fan translation I've read, as obviously and unfortunately there's no official translation of this manga either, but according to that translation, Kenichi seems to be wishing for revenge on his bullies, which if accurate is much different from his initial motivations in the Kenichi manga, with those being more noble and less selfish than revenge. Though Kenichi does end up aligning more with that way of thinking later in this version, which I actually think is a bit more interesting, with it giving Kenichi a bit of development that he loses otherwise, and also painting him as less of the saint he's made out to be in Kenichi, at least initially. Despite that though, he's still just as resolute, and the next day he makes his way to a dojo to begin training. And the dojo he goes to turns out to be Ryozanpaku, with him finding it on his own without even having talked to Miyu so far. As apparently in this version, it's the only dojo he can get to from his house by walking, and there, similarly to the Kenichi manga, he meets the elder in front of the gate. Though the elder here looks a little bit different, having a shorter beard and slightly less imposing physique. And after greeting him, he gives Kenichi the tour of the dojo, where once again we get to meet the individual masters, who all have similar but somewhat different designs, with Sakaki and Kensei being more or less the same, though with Kensei looking a bit older and having a yin-yang symbol on his sleeve, as well as Akisame, who is apparently a big Flock of Seagulls fan in this universe.
Hey, do you like Flock of Seagulls?
And dear God, what did they do to Apachai? We also get a glimpse of Shigure here, who doesn't actually appear in the manga, unfortunately, as well as another mysterious resident of Ryozanpaku. I wonder who it could be. It's Miyu. With it being a coincidence that Miyu happens to live at this specific dojo in this version, which is much less interesting to me than his portrayal in the Kenichi manga, where I thought the progression of Miyu helping Kenichi overcome one of his bullies herself and then recommending Kenichi to come to Ryozanpaku after seeing his resolve was one of the more interesting parts of the manga's beginning. But in this version, before we even meet Miyu, Kenichi's training actually begins, similarly to how it's presented in the Kenichi manga, but in this version there's a fun little interaction at the beginning, with the elder telling Akisame to teach Kenichi one of his secret techniques off the bat, since he's only trying to get revenge, a request which Akisame obliges, tossing Kenichi around briefly before actually training him properly later. An interaction that I thought was pretty humorous, but also interesting as it seemed a bit out of character for the masters we would come to know later. Afterwards though, Kenichi's training actually begins, the same as it does in the manga and anime, with the other masters joining in and Miyu pulling him off to the side to teach him a technique to help him. Though a different technique, as in this version Kenichi's in the judo club instead of the karate club. A completely superfluous change you might have picked up on already, but one that I thought I'd mention nonetheless. And after Miyu teaches him the technique, he uses it to beat a bully in the club the next day, as well as when that bully shows up with some goons afterwards, where Kenichi's able to dispatch them all with ease thanks to his basic training. And something interesting to note here is Kenichi's character, with him showing more confidence and being much less afraid in the face of the thugs than he would normally be in the Kenichi manga, a trait that remains throughout the run of this manga and one I actually find a bit more endearing, as he still retains a softer, more nervous edge to him, but for the most part he's much more calm and level-headed before fights in this manga. Not that I don't like Kenichi the way he's portrayed in Kenichi, but I do find his overly high-strung nervousness to get quite annoying after a while, especially the later you get in the manga, with it feeling like despite all the moments of him overcoming his fear, he never really progresses past it. But depending on your preference, the pendulum might swing a bit far in the other direction here, and I would probably be most appreciative of a middle ground between the two myself. And after the first fight, we continue to the next day where Kenichi's being sought after by another strong fighter, much the same as it goes with Tsukuba in the Kenichi manga, but also mixed with the challenge between Kenichi and Daimonji, with Kenichi accidentally challenging the vice captain of the judo club to the same wager that he and Daimonji would make. But this time the vice captain actually quits after being defeated, with the actual captain being impressed by Kenichi's skills. And afterwards we get to see Nijima too. What? And in the next chapter, we get to learn a little bit about this version of Miyu, with the most interesting differences I found to be that she still goes to a different school than Kenichi, and that she's studying bone setting and acupuncture from Kensei and Akisame, which she demonstrates by using acupressure on Kenichi during sparring, which I actually really like, as it gives Miyu a bit more depth to her character than she has in the future Kenichi manga, giving her interesting goals and motivations that are unique to her, rather than just be woman like in the Kenichi manga. So I think her wanting to be a doctor in this version, for me, actually elevates her character over her depiction in the Kenichi manga, where despite her being one of the main characters, I thought out of all the female characters within that, she was probably the least interesting. Though this version doesn't have one of my favorite parts of the early Kenichi manga that I highlighted when I covered it before, that being Kenichi and Miyu's friendship coming from their mutual bullying experience, with this manga never really painting Miyu as a victim of psychological bullying like Kenichi does, which is a shame since I really like that aspect to their relationship. Getting back to the manga though, the next day at school, Kenichi runs into some thugs beating up Nijima, so he takes them out and saves Nijima, with this being the inception of the Nijima we would all come to know and love. But Kenichi's defeating of the thugs draws the eye of another powerful foe, a boxer named Takanouchi Iki, who tries to recruit Kenichi into his group of delinquents, with this basically being the origins of the Technique trio, though Takanouchi's character would be the only one of the three carried over to the Kenichi manga, with him being the basis for Takeda's character. And though Kenichi is drawn in initially by their offer of friendship, once they take him to try and shake people down for money, Kenichi ends up making enemies out of them, with one of them bringing a group to jump Kenichi the next day on his walk home, but luckily Kenichi is prepared for them and is able to fight them off, once again very calmly and effectively on his own, showing off that major difference in his personality between the two mangas that I talked about before. After the group fight though, on his way back home, Kenichi's ambushed again, this time by Takanouchi, who is able to beat him pretty handedly, somewhat due to Kenichi being tired from the group fight earlier, but mostly due to his skill. Luckily for Kenichi though, Miyu jumps in to save him, where she calls on Takanouchi's sense of pride to postpone the fight for another week. And afterwards, the story continues pretty much the same as the story of Kenichi, with Apachai training Kenichi, although during the training there isn't the character arc of Apachai trying to learn how to hold back, which is a little disappointing since that little bit of the Kenichi manga was great for getting to know not just Apachai but all the masters a little bit better, and we never really get that in this version of the story, with it being much more condensed and focusing mostly on just Kenichi. There's a pretty big difference that comes up during Kenichi's training in this version though, that being that Kenichi breaks his leg during training, so he ends up having to fight Takanouchi with a broken leg, making it even harder on him in this version than it would be in the subsequent Takeda fight. Though Kenichi does come out on top in the end all the same, but during the fight we learn Takanouchi's backstory, which is much different than Takeda's, where we find out that he's being blackmailed by the leader of his delinquent group in order to force him to work for them, which is significantly different to Takeda's, who to be honest, I think is much more interesting than Takanouchi's. But after Kenichi wins, like Takeda, Takanouchi quits being a delinquent after the fight. Also like Takeda though, he gets jumped out for quitting, but in this version, afterwards the doctors say he'll never be able to box again. And I think we all know where this goes. That's right, to Akisame to heal him up of course, and after the Takanouchi fight, we get a chapter that covers a dojo challenge, which I think is at least an interesting thing to note because unlike in Kenichi where the same thing happens and it's used as a lesson for Kenichi, in this version he just kind of gets his ass kicked until Sakaki comes in to save him, which I think is a testament to show just how much Matsuna improved between writing this series and Kenichi. Now, the next chapter covers the end of this band of delinquents, with the leader taking Nijima hostage to lure Kenichi into a trap, where he threatens to kill Nijima if Kenichi fights back. So in true Kuwabara fashion, Kenichi takes a pummeling from his underlings. That is until Miyu is able to sneak around and save Nijima, though not before unleashing a flurry of dick kicks on these poor guys. Thanks to Miyu saving Nijima though, Kenichi can go all out and he takes the rest of the members and the leader down, with the leader being dropped from the group by the actual leader above him afterward, who we find out, much like in Kenichi, is Kisara in this version, with her looking pretty similar to her final design, albeit with her hair down and a bit longer as well. We also find out here that she's a member of what is known as the top 3 in this gang, which is this story's version of the 8 Fists, though obviously with only 3 members instead of 8 like in Kenichi. And after all this goes down, we see Kenichi run across one of the members from the meeting, who is the older brother of one of the delinquents Kenichi beat up before, and he sees him mercilessly bullying someone, which causes him to go into action, where in a bit of an interesting twist on Kenichi's character, he beats up the guy and gives him a taste of his own medicine, dragging him by his nose ring around the school and humiliating him in front of everyone, which on one hand seems a bit out of character when compared to the second manga, but on the other kind of doesn't, because the guy really did deserve something like this in a way, but it's still weird because it's usually not Kenichi's MO to do stuff like this, but it was also pretty badass too, so I'll let it slide. And afterward, Kenichi and Miyu go on their date like in the Kenichi manga, but with the big difference here being that it's crashed by Kisara, with this being the three's first meeting, and the fight between Kisara and Miyu goes basically the same as it does in Kenichi. But Kisara also mentioned something here that's pretty interesting, the name of her gang, which is called Snake instead of Ragnarok in this version. And the next day at school, Takanouchi gives Kenichi the rundown on Snake, revealing that the top three are the strongest and warning him to be wary of them. But unlike Takeda, Takanouchi has no interest in helping Kenichi out against them, with him also telling Nijima to warn Kenichi specifically about Hermit, which Nijima doesn't do out of spite after finding out about Miyu and Kenichi living together. So instead, Kenichi ends up running into Hermit on his own, where they have a brief skirmish on the train tracks before being interrupted by an oncoming train, a set piece that I don't think is near as cool as their later fight on the bus, which I think is a shame since this is the only similar encounter between the two in this version. And in the next chapter, we get introduced to this version of the Shinpaku Alliance, which is even more ragtag than the initial group in the later version. Rather than that though, the rest of the chapter focuses on Sakaki fighting an old assassin compatriot of his, which is very similar to the battle with Christopher that takes place after the Ragnarok saga concludes in the manga and OVAs. Though instead of Christopher here, it's a man named Mycroft who looks like Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, and King Kong Bundy fused together. And the fight goes pretty much the same as the Christopher fight, with the biggest difference here being Kenichi accidentally shooting Sakaki afterward, which was freaking hilarious. Afterwards, we shift focus to Miyu, with Kisara trying to get back at her for beating her in their last confrontation. So she devises a scheme to get her to fight by threatening a stray cat that Miyu's been visiting, with Kisara saying that she threw the cat into the river in order to get Miyu to fight her seriously, which causes Miyu to go berserk and take out her whole crew, with Miyu going wild until Kenichi shows up to stop her, where one of Kisara's henchmen revealed that they didn't actually hurt the cat and that Kisara would never do something like that because much like Kenichi, in this version Kisara still likes cats almost as much as Miyu. So after being thoroughly beaten by Miyu, Kisara retreats for now, and in the next chapter Kenichi ends up fighting an old student of Akisame's. Although despite being taught by Akisame, he was never allowed to be a disciple at Ryozanpaku for some reason. Even though if we cut back to chapter 1, Kenichi had a hard time not joining, so that's kind of weird. But once he learns of Kenichi having become a disciple of Ryozanpaku, even though he couldn't, he challenges Kenichi to a fight, where Kenichi does get defeated, but impresses the other guy. Not really an important chapter or anything, but it is unique to this story, so I thought I'd at least mention it. And the next day at school, Kenichi gets some new club members, with 4 new students joining the gardening club, with only 2 really being of note, those being Natsu Sugimoto, this story's version of Tanimoto, who looks pretty similar to Tanimoto, though with longer hair, kind of like Kisara, and Izumi, with the other 2 girls only really joining because of Sugimoto. Though much like Tanimoto and Kenichi, Sugimoto is only here to get close to Kenichi at school, with him making his move as Hermit the next day while Kenichi and Izumi are walking home together, where he has a group ambush them and kidnap Izumi, but not before bashing her over the head with a baseball bat. Seriously, this series really liked to use that much more than Kenichi did, and on normal people too, like Kenichi pre-training and Izumi, which could potentially be fatal in real life. So I do prefer the Kenichi version where stuff like this doesn't happen very much, since it makes it just a tad more realistic and I don't have to suspend my disbelief as much. But after the thugs make off with Izumi, Kenichi gives chase only to be stopped by Hermit. Luckily though, Miyu was following Kenichi and Izumi because she was jealous, so she's able to make her way past Hermit while Kenichi holds him off, and we get a cool couple of pages where Miyu chases after the car they took Izumi in, with some really nice art from Matsuna that I thought I'd highlight. After Miyu arrives at the hideout though, we find out the reason the thugs kidnapped Izumi was because they thought that she was Miyu, with some no-name ordering them to kidnap her so he could beat Miyu in order to take Kisara's place amongst the top 3. But instead Miyu beats them up and saves Izumi, and afterwards we continue Kenichi and Hermit's fight, where Kenichi ends up losing but is saved by the ragtag Shinpaku Alliance, with Nijima leading Hermit away so Kenichi can escape. And with Kenichi's loss to Hermit, the masters take him to the mountains for some training, which is pretty similar to the beach training from Kenichi, but with some minor differences, like Miyu saving Kenichi and Nijima from drowning but hurting her leg in the process, leaving it to Kenichi to stand up to a bear instead of a shark to protect her, with them being saved by the elder this time as well. And after returning from training, Kenichi and Miyu are ambushed by Hermit and Kisara, though as Kisara reveals, not with the intent to attack them, but instead to offer them to join them, with her expounding that a war is coming up with a rival gang from the next town over called Ragnarok, so their leader is trying to recruit as many strong people as possible to bolster their numbers. Though Kenichi and Miyu refuse to even consider their offer, with Miyu teasing Kisara the whole time, which Hermit interrupts, saying that he intends to take over Snake and orders his lackeys to attack Kenichi, Miyu, and Kisara, with Miyu and Kisara taking them out pretty easily while Kenichi fights Hermit, who reveals to Kenichi that he's Sugimoto from the gardening club, with this fight going pretty similarly to Kenichi and Tanimoto's church fight, though not quite as dramatic without about Honoka's kidnapping, but Sugimoto being in the gardening club and actively getting closer to Kenichi rather than Miyu in this version does somewhat make up for it, with the fight being a little bit more personal to Kenichi than it would have been otherwise. But instead of settling things here, Sugimoto runs off after being surrounded by the three of them, though during the fight we did learn about his backstory in this version, which is pretty similar to Tanimoto's with some minor changes, with it being a bit more vague in some parts and a bit more detailed than some others. And afterwards, the next chapter covers Izumi visiting the dojo, which goes pretty much exactly like how it does in Kenichi, except at the start we get something pretty interesting, with Kisara still trying to recruit Miyu to join Snake despite her still vehemently refusing. Getting back to the main plot after that chapter though, Sugimoto challenges Kenichi to another fight, where he reveals the name of his master, who is still Sogetsu in this version, though we do get to see him in a flashback in the chapter where you may notice he looks a bit different in this manga. Getting to the fight though, it goes about how you would expect, with Kenichi beating Sugimoto, but only thanks to a momentary distraction by Honoka. Other than that though, after the fight goes pretty much the same as in Kenichi, with the exception of Sugimoto and Honoka never getting close like her and Tanimoto do in Kenichi, which is a bit of a shame since I really like that character dynamic in Kenichi. And the story after the fight continues very similarly as well, with Kensei looking for Sogetsu, sadly though without Ranka making an appearance this time around. Instead it happens during a Ryozanpaku trip to the beach, which also sees Nijima and Izumi joining them, with Izumi getting along well with Honoka due to their mutual disdain for Miyu's giant honkers. Which I thought was funny since I don't think they ever even meet in the Kenichi manga. And it goes like every Ryozanpaku trip, with Kenichi working at the stand they set up for training instead of being allowed to have fun. That is until some Yakuza show up and start picking on a kid, leading Miyu and Kenichi to jump in and help the kid deal with them, which is how they ultimately meet up with Sogetsu, who's working for the Yakuza. And after learning about their connection to Kensei, he beats both of them with ease and kidnaps Miyu, telling Kenichi to have Kensei meet him at the lighthouse in order to save her. So after regaining consciousness, Kenichi and Kensei head to the lighthouse to save Miyu, where meanwhile, Sogetsu tells Miyu about his and Kensei's backstory, with it somewhat being similar to the one we know, but with a major difference, where their father has them fight each other to see who would become the new leader of their dojo, with Sogetsu winning the fight, but only because Kensei was holding back as revealed by their father, with Kensei leaving the dojo to Sogetsu afterwards. So now Sogetsu wants to challenge Kensei to a death match to prove that he's stronger, saying if Kensei doesn't fight him seriously that he'll kill Miyu, which Miyu takes pretty well, mostly thanks to the sake Sogetsu gave her, something that took me by surprise a little bit because it did seem out of character for Miyu, but it was also hilarious, so I'll let it slide. Meanwhile though, we cut back to the family of the kid Kenichi helped earlier, with them talking to some of the masters when the Yakuza plow a goddamn truck into their house, which enrages the masters, especially Apachai, who chases them down and obliterates their car with his bare hands. Getting back to Sogetsu and Kensei though, they begin their fight while Kenichi sneaks up the lighthouse to rescue Miyu, who is completely tits up off sake. And after Kenichi rescues Miyu, we get the conclusion to Kensei's fight, where Sogetsu actually dies this time, it seems, though Kensei does seem to get over it much quicker than in Kenichi if that is the case, which is a bit weird. But after all of that, we get back to town where Kisara resumes her quest to recruit Miyu, with her getting some help this time from Takashima, who much like in Kenichi is jealous of Miyu showing her up in the rhythmic gymnastics club. So in order to paint Miyu as a delinquent to the teacher, she tries to help Kisara befriend Miyu, which ends up with the three of them hanging out at Kisara's house, where we get to find out a bit more about Kisara's family situation than we ever do in Kenichi, as well as some fun interactions between the three, which ends with them being attacked by a group from Ragnarok, where they're saved by the leader of Snake, who's known as Top 1, who is also just Berserker from Kenichi, but with a bit of a more likable personality, though he still has the same traits, being a self-taught fighting genius in this series as well. And we get some more information on him via Kisara, who tells Miyu and Takashima about her first encounter with them, where he helped her out against a group of guys and showed off his proficiency and love of fighting by perfectly executing one of Kisara's kicks, which causes Miyu to start to fret about Kenichi and try to prepare him for their fight, though their training is interrupted by Nijima, who tells him that Top 1 is targeting Takanouchi, where Top 1 takes him out pretty similarly to how Berserker takes out Takeda and Kenichi. So after learning how tough he is, the Elder trains Kenichi similar to how he trains him to fight Ryuto, though without going into the mountains, instead keeping the training localized to Ryozanpaku. And after a bit of special training, Kenichi challenges Top 1 to a fight, with the location being Ryozanpaku. Now, I like the idea of this ending, and I'm glad it exists in this version at least, because I always thought Kenichi versus Berserker would have been a good fight to see in the series. series, with it being raw, unfiltered talent versus pure hard work and no talent. However, the fight in this version, I feel, is a bit anticlimactic, with it only being 2 chapters, which isn't that short in reality, as so far I've neglected to mention something I both like and dislike about this manga, which is the fact that it was a monthly manga as opposed to a weekly manga like Kenichi was. So the chapters here are on average double the length of Kenichi's chapters, which on one hand I like, as it's able to flesh out its ideas and plot points more in a single chapter than usually allotted to a weekly manga. However, it does also mean that some things are rushed through more in order to fit as much content as possible into a single chapter. As well, this is good for fights since the extra pages give more time to resolve a fight in a given chapter, rather than spacing it out over multiple chapters and breaking up the flow. Despite that though, this fight felt very rushed to the end, with it having nowhere near the gravitas of previous fights, or the Ryuto fight at the end of the Ragnarok saga in Kenichi. So rather than feeling like an insurmountable wall to overcome, instead Top 1 feels more like a slight challenge. As well, we never really get to know Top 1 all that well, or should I say that there isn't really much to know about him, because aside from his love of fighting, nothing else really drives him, and he never seems anywhere near as cruel as Berserker or Ryuto show themselves to be in Kenichi, which is a real shame I thought, since the whole manga has been building up to this fight, with it not really delivering on that build-up like Kenichi would come to do afterwards. And that's just it. I think the ending feels rushed and anticlimactic because it was. Now, I have no proof to back this up, but from the way the story resolves, it feels like Kenichi got picked up in Weekly Shonen Sunday at this point, so Matsuno just had to wrap up the story of History's Strongest within a chapter or two. Despite that though, I do like the very ending of it, with both Top 1 and Kisara joining Ryozanpaku as fellow students, which also spits in the face of that one dude they wouldn't let join the dojo even more. And even if the story did leave a few things open-ended and rushed to the close, I still had fun with this story and its look at what Kenichi could have been with some interesting changes here and there. Some that I think are best left behind in the story, while some things I actually enjoyed more than in Kenichi proper and wish they could have made their way into the sequel. Stuff like Miyu's ambitions of being a doctor, as well as the way her and Kisara become friends, which I actually really enjoyed and might have even been my favorite part of the whole manga here. As well as Kenichi's slightly more stoic personality like I mentioned before, and some other small changes here and there. Aside from that though, I think I much prefer the Kenichi manga over History's Strongest. It just hits much higher highs for me, and unlike History's Strongest, has a much stronger running start thanks to it. As well, while writing the script, I couldn't help but feel the chapters of History's Strongest felt pretty disconnected and didn't really flow into each other as well as in Kenichi, though that might just be another fault of it being monthly rather than weekly. But what did you guys think of this prototype Kenichi manga? Have you read it before, or is this your first time hearing about it? Either way, make sure to tell me your guys' thoughts in the comments, because personally I had a pretty fun time reading it and I'm really curious what you all think about it. Also, make sure to subscribe, because next time I cover Kenichi, we're going to be getting back into the meat of things following the D tournament. So make sure you don't miss it, and this has been CJ from Team Millennium Ninja, headed back to the village hidden in the internet.